We're reading Parshat Ekev. Again, it's Deuteronomy, and Moses is repeating to this new generation many things that they may not know, but that he thinks they should know before they go into the land. My comments this week, I want to do two things, which I'm not going to go too far out of my way to connect with each other. There are two distinct things I want to comment on. The first is a section of Torah specifically in this parsha that we are familiar with because we say it in most of our services. It's the section of Torah that I sometimes call Parshat Climate Change. The parsha that says when you do the mitzvot, the rains will come at their proper time, and when you don't do the mitzvot, it could work out otherwise. And over the years, there have been various different attitudes towards that. Many liberal movements at one point removed it from the Siddur entirely. The Reconstructionist Siddur has that section as there's an alternative that one can do. But I wanted to read it here a little bit more in context, just so we can hear what the context of that is. In Deuteronomy chapter 11. And so in context, it reads as this: therefore, shall you keep all the commandment which I command you this day, that you may be strong and go in and possess the land where you go over to possess it, and that you may prolong your days upon the land which the Lord swore to your ancestors to give to them and to their seed, a land flowing with milk and honey. For the land where you go in to possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you came out, where you planted your seed and watered it with your foot as a garden of herbs. But the land where you go over to possess is a land of hills and valleys, and drinks water as the rain of heaven comes down, a land which the Lord your God cares for the eyes of the Lord your God are always upon it, from the beginning of the year even to the end of the year. And it shall come to pass, if you shall listen diligently to my commandments, which I command you this day, to love the Lord your God and to serve God with all your heart and with all your soul, that I will give the rain of your land in its season, the former rain and the later rain, that you may gather in your corn, your wine, and your oil. And I will give grass in your fields for your cattle, and you shall eat and be satisfied. Take heed to yourselves, lest your heart be deceived, and you turn aside and serve other gods and worship them. And the anger of the Lord should be kindled against you, and God shuts up the heavens so there be no rain, and the ground shall not yield her fruit, and you perish quickly from off the good land which the Lord gives you. Therefore shall you lay up these words in your heart and in your soul, and you shall bind them for a sign upon your hand, and they shall be for frontlets between your eyes, and you shall teach them to your children, talking of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. And you shall write them upon the doorposts of your house and upon your gates, so that your days may be multiplied in the days of your children upon the land which the Lord swore to your ancestors to give them, as the days of the heavens above the earth. So when we read this section of Torah as the second paragraph of the Shema, it sounds like if we do the mitzvot, if we're keeping kosher correctly, if we're keeping Shabbat correctly, the rains will come, and if not, then not. In more recent years, if you apply it to the mitzvot of how we take care of the earth, it begins to sound like we're acknowledging this connection between how we live and the way the climate responds. In this context, perhaps it's even more saying that in Egypt, the water, and hence God's blessing, would flow all on its own to you. It was in the river. You would water it with your foot, which is something that perhaps is still, at least until recent years, was done. It's like a bicycle type of situation. where you're bicycling and you move the water up into the channels, the irrigation channels. But in the land of Israel, there is no constant source of water. It's all dependent upon the rain. So God is taking presumably a more active hand in it. And so do we also therefore have to take a more active hand. This section could be read to say that where you're going, it requires more mutual participation, more joint participation. You can't be a bystander. The blessings are not going to come by themselves. You have to put yourself into it to get something out of it. So much of it is dependent upon your participation as well as God's response. And so that is another message that can come out of this section. The other comments I wanted to make also have to do with our participation, and also has to do with the land of Israel. These comments have to do with what has been going on in Israel socially, politically, and how we might respond to those. And what I would like to do, it's unusual for me, I want to share with you someone else's words. I want to share with you the words of Rabbi Daniel Hartman, who is the president of the Shalom Hartman Center. And Shalom Hartman was his father. Shalom Hartman Institute, it's a Jerusalem-based think tank that promotes pluralism and liberal values in Israel and beyond. Literally hundreds of North American rabbis and Jewish lay leaders have cycled through their programs, which promote diversity, civil discourse, and what they call the democratic character of Israel. And first, as a summary, Rabbi Daniel Hartman urges critics of the judicial reforms and Netanyahu's government to take a deep breath, not because he supports the proposals, he does not, but he warns that the bill passed on Monday represents one of the least controversial planks in Netanyahu's reform plan, and that the massive demonstrations against those proposals have united an Israeli consensus around what he is calling a new social coalition. So Hartman thinks Netanyahu was playing a weak hand, the Palestinian issue is on the back burner, and North American Jews should channel their gloom over the current legislation into support for its opponents. So these are his words, and I urge you to listen to them, and perhaps we can talk about them after the service before we leave. He says, overall, there are 5 big reform proposals, including the way the Israeli Supreme Court is elected, the power of the attorneys general, and the override clause. The last one is the one the Haredi Orthodox want, because no matter who was on the Supreme Court or what they decide, they could just cancel it out. That's just the end of democracy. So Netanyahu pushed the least controversial one, the easiest one, to get a first victory. It's far from the end. This was just the beginning of a 3-year war, he says. This is going to go on until 2026. That's when the next elections are, and the government won't fall before then. It can't fall, because unless there's an internal split in Netanyahu's party, neither the far-right government ministers or the Haredim will ever join with the Arabs or the opposition to vote this government out. They'll fetch, they'll complain, they'll threaten, but they can't leave, and that's what makes it so strange that Netanyahu seems so intimidated by them, because he holds all the power. They have no power. Where are they going to go? Who are they going to sit with? If they vote against the right-wing government, their careers will be over. The consequence of last year's election was these judicial reforms proposals, which raised a fundamental question. What is the nature of our country? Trump wasn't the end of America, but his election asked the question, what is America? I believe, says Hartman, that this is the last Likud-led government, and it certainly is the last right-wing government. This whole reform issue has created an awareness that there are different coalitions being formed in Israel, which aren't being formed around the right-left wing divide. That divide doesn't really exist anymore. On the fringes, there is a left-wing socialist camp, and on the other side, there's a right-wing settler group. Other than that, 80% of Israel is not divided under the left or right-wing categories. You see at the demonstrations and in the polls that 20 to 30% of those who used to be on the right are still on the right, but no longer want to vote for Netanyahu. They want to find alternative expressions. If liberal American Jews fight and stand up and you don't walk away, there are partners in Israel who are looking at you and who feel encouraged by you. What we need to do over the next 3 years is to frame a new social coalition in Israel around internal values of liberal Zionism and liberal Judaism, which 80% of Israelis accept. Then we can win, and that's where 2026 is going to change. But he's using liberal Zionism, liberal Zionists, differently. Liberal, he's using differently. He says, it's very interesting how the category of liberalism has been reclaimed in Israeli society. While in America, the term liberalism is divisive, actually in Israel, it is becoming more inclusive. It's the old liberalism of liberties, a belief in Zionism and the right of the Jewish people to a state, but one that believes in human rights in a diverse public sphere and that respects law and the Supreme Court. It's the old Likud, the old Menachem Begin. It's not the Smotrich or Ben Gvir or the Haredi parties. As for the Palestinian issue, liberal Zionism in Israel, he says, recognizes that we don't want to be an occupier of another people. But for the vast majority of Israelis, the issue is, quote, the Palestinians want to murder me. There is no Palestinian Authority today, says Hartman. The Palestinian Authority controls their headquarters in Ramallah and 3 upper middle class towns in the West Bank. Hamas and Islamic Jihad would run away with any election. So it's very hard to even have a conversation about Palestinian rights in Israel when you feel you're talking about a society that wants to kill you. So I distinguish, he says, between tolerable occupiers and intolerable occupiers. Intolerable occupiers are those who believe that we have no right, no, intolerable occupiers are those who believe that we have a right to all of Israel, that Palestinian lives don't matter. It's a combination of ultranationalism, fascism, and messianism. That's one group. Then there's a whole massive group for whom the whole reason why the occupation continues is that they believe there is no peace partner and that Israel's survival is in danger if we do anything. Hartman says, people think I'm liberal. I'm more or less liberal. I'm for a 2-state solution. I just don't know how to implement it. But now, when you have a government, as we do, that is not even willing to admit that Palestinians have rights, or is not yearning for a peaceful solution, then of course we lose. That's what Netanyahu is doing since he sits now with these far-right people. He has quieted all the moral conversation when it comes to Israeli political life. So when that happens, of course, people with a moral voice will say, what's going on here? Because it's true, Zionism has ceded the moral conversation to the anti-Zionist camp. Still, I think we can create a unified liberal Zionist conversation, even though North American Jews and Israeli Jews might have a different opinion on what is the most viable solution right now. As for Tisha B'Av, last week was the 9th of Av, the anniversary of the destruction of the temple, and many, especially And many people were comparing the place we've gotten to with Israel to Tisha B'Av and the destruction of the temples. And Hartman says, we mourn the destruction of the temple. We learn from the destruction of the temple, but we don't declare the temple destroyed before it's destroyed. Everything in Jewish history is about hope. It's about working under impossible conditions. And Israel is now working under impossible conditions. That's true. There is a government which is advocating for an Israel that half of Israel and 90% of North American Jewry wants nothing to do with. But Israel is not defined by its government alone. People have a voice. What the demonstrations make clear is that the vast majority of Israelis do not support these proposals. It's one thing to turn your back on the Israeli government, but we're out there marching. We don't embrace destruction before it happens, but we get to work. There is a blueprint forward. The vast majority of Israelis now are embracing a liberal Zionism of the type I mentioned. North American Jews have partners. They might not be perfect partners, but they have partners. Why walk away from Israel when the majority of Israelis are now saying things they never said before? Like, I care about the Supreme Court. I care about human rights. I care about the rights of minorities. This is what they're talking about at every demonstration. So tell those who are talking as if the destruction has happened. We waited 2,000 freaking years to have this country. Can you wait another 3? And could you fight for 3 years? Because if you fight and you stand up and you don't walk away, there are partners in Israel who are looking at you and who feel encouraged by you. We can build it. He did. He did. And the connection between the two halves of what I said is our participation is necessary. Participation is necessary. So I hope this has given us something to think about. My take on what has been going on, and well, both in Israel and in America, is when things start looking even worse, that becomes the command to push forward. That if only, and we have to find that strength in ourselves, because we have to do it, if nothing else, because of who we are, because it's part of us. It's what we are about. And we know that if we don't push, things really will get worse. So we got to reach into ourselves and find the vision that we want to see both America and Israel and the climate to be, and then find a way to live, for us to live into that vision. And scream out to bring others along. So the first word in this week's Parsha, Ekev, also means heel. It's like on the heels of. So maybe I can read that as goad. Kicking us along. The Hayat Ekev Tishma'un. It shall come to pass because you hearken to these ordinances. It's on the heels of hearing and obeying these ordinances. On the heels of obeying them. So let's talk about that in upcoming moments and maybe after the service.